how do we take advantage of the amazing things that are happening in enterprise data technology, in all the amazing things that we're now hearing about with AI, to actually make business better, to make people have better experiences. And sometimes that thread gets lost a little bit. We get so caught up in the technology, we forget why we actually doing this. But sometimes they're afraid to say, "I don't know," right? And in some cases, I don't blame them. It's hard, right? You have to get up and say, "Look, there's this completely new way of doing something that I've been doing for 10, 20, in some cases at PepsiCo and Disney, 40 years, right? And it's different. And everything I thought I knew about how to do my job and how many people it would require and how much investment I have to put in is changing." And everyone loves change if it doesn't affect them, right? Right. I mean, and that's the nature of that process. So it can be difficult, and it can be hard, and it can be humbling, right? And I think if you go in there with the attitude that this is about learning, this is about experience, and we have to be part of how these things change, and that means your path might eventually lead somewhere else, and that's what happened with me and others. We are part of a story. We're part of a chapter in a book, right? And that book, you have one that is your own life, your own book, your own story, your own experience. And the other is the life of these companies. And sometimes you'll be part of them, sometimes you won't. But I think if you can find, again, going back to the things that matter, find culture, find innovation, find curiosity, and use those as your North Stars for change. And be confident in the fact that learning is the most powerful tool you can possess. I think those are all powerful qualities. And at well-run companies like the ones I worked for, I think, we've seen success with it.
Welcome to Are You Human podcast. On this episode, you'll hear a conversation I have with Vikram Somaya. Vikram has been a pioneer in data-driven decision-making for global brands since early 2000s. He has built and led data analytics and AI organizations at companies like PepsiCo, where he grew the team from 0 to over 1,000 people as Chief Data and Analytics Officer. Previously, Vikram served as Chief Data Officer at Nielsen Global Media and built the first data platforms for ESPN, Disney, The Weather Company, and Thomson Reuters. Currently, Vikram holds board positions at Ripple Street, Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment, and nonprofit First Street Foundation. With his wealth of experience, Vikram is here to share insights on leveraging data for business success in today's world. I'm excited for this conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
Are you human?
Hi, Vikram. Our common friend Sal Rashidi told me so many great things about you. I'm really, really curious to hear all the things you've been doing since you left PepsiCo, right?
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. First of all, thank you for having me. It's always nice to talk to people who have something interesting to say and interesting questions to ask. Yeah, PepsiCo and I parted ways in late January, and since then, there are very few times in life when you really get an opportunity to explore what's going on outside the world that you're very used to. Large corporate companies, that becomes your universe to some degree, especially when there is large PepsiCo, 185 markets. We had a lot of work to do. I was running a team of about 1,100 people all in. That's a full-time, very consuming job. And so I've had the opportunity now to spend a lot of time with everyone from young startups who are working in all forms of AI and what's happening in analytics in the world today. And then also medium to large corporations. So companies that are really thinking through some of the same problems that PepsiCo was, or ESPN was, or Nielsen was, some of the companies I've worked at in the past. And that freedom has been very enjoyable. I've really, really had a good time.
Was it deliberate that you chose those industries, media and then retail, or you just happened to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think anything in my life has been wildly deliberate. I've had ADD my whole life. It is part of how I function. And, as with all things neuro, there are pros and cons to how my brain works. I like a lot of stimulus. I really enjoy people. I need a lot of data to process things. But then when I'm ready to, I move on. And that has informed my career in a lot of ways. When I came out of college, and I originally went to Yale for molecular biology and biochemistry. and graduated with a degree in the history of architecture. That's not so wildly different because my mother and my sister are both architects, and it's something I grew up with. But when I graduated, I went to work initially for a creative advertising agency called Cliff Freeman and Partners. And, the notion of what Cliff did, because he focused on using people to create emotional messaging. And that story then sat with me in a variety of different ways over time, because the next phase I went to was into the startup world. And I spent, I think it was 12 years at 4 different startups, all in the early consumer data space. The early days of web analytics, companies like Omniture that originated really some of how analytics was used, using sort of internet technology. And then companies like BlueKai, which became the heart of the Oracle Data Cloud, and was one of the first creators of the DMP, the data management platforms used by large corporations that have now sort of morphed into consumer data platforms and various other ways to understand people. But I think the thread that linked all those things was I was interested in how people behaved. And I was interested in people, period. And that then translated into the next half of my career, which became media. So I spent time at Reuters. I spent time at the Weather Channel, which is going through an amazing transformation. And then finally originated the role of Global Data Officer at ESPN and Disney Media. And then finally spent some time at Nielsen before I spent the last just over 4 years at PepsiCo as its first Chief Data and Analytics Officer.
Yeah, because I understand that this type of role, together with Chief Digital Officers, is quite new.
It is. Yep.
Was it when you joined? Was it part of your job to define what you are going to do?
Absolutely. And I know, Sil Rashidi introduced me, and she and I share a lot of common thoughts around sort of the changing nature of this job. And I don't think it's just the CDAO job that's changing. I think it's all the jobs around technology and consumer that are sort of, some of them have been legacy jobs for a long time, the CTO, the CIO, the CMO. And some of them are much newer, the Chief Analytics Officer, the Chief Data Officer, in my case, Chief Data and Analytics Officer. The origination now of what they're calling Chief AI Officer, which is nonsensical because AI has been around for a long time and has been very much part and the heart in some cases of what analytics has been for a lot of these companies. Those jobs are all beginning to merge, right? And depending on which company you look at, what stage of their data and analytics journey they're on, what size they are, what companies they operate in, those roles can be wildly different, right? Depending on how they have chosen to operate and who they have chosen in many cases to lead those functions. So if we go back to sort of the heart of the Chief Data and Analytics Officer role, it really has been, how do we use data and information better at the company? How do we take advantage of the amazing things that are happening in enterprise data technology, in all the amazing things that we're now hearing about with AI, to actually make business better, to make people have better experiences? And sometimes that thread gets lost a little bit. We get so caught up in the technology, we forget why we actually doing this. And I think the human connection is what links those two things together, both the employees, the consumers and guests and associates they serve. I love all the words that people use to describe the people that they service. And then finally, obviously, what we as leaders find interesting and useful and how we create culture around it.
And you've been going through, you were in it when pandemic happened and the whole consumer behavior shifted, right? I guess now it's, in some aspects, it's coming back to what it was, and in some aspects it stayed. But how did you see it from the inside?
I had a fascinating experience. So I joined PepsiCo in, I think it was fall of 2019. And I had a wonderful boss, Hugh Johnston, who was the CFO of the company at the time. He's then subsequently moved on to Disney, and oddly. and what Hugh gave me time to do was to go and listen to the company. And there were obviously some specific needs that were required, but it was really about understanding what the company required. And so I had the time. I spent time between then and, oddly, March of 2020. To really go out and visit the company. And again, this is a far-flung company, many countries, many continents, many offices, many people. And it was an amazing experience because I presented the first time to the executive committee in March of 2020, the first week. 1 week after that, the company shut down, as did the rest of the world. And I had then the opportunity to build a team, but within the confines of COVID. And it was an astonishing experience. When I got there, it was a team of one, me. And when I left in January of 2024, this January, we were at 1,100 people.
Wow.
And one of the things that I focused on was I recognized that there was a lot of things that needed to be done. But in order to preserve the culture and legacy of what the company had built, and also to bring in new blood, we ensured that our teams were always 50-50, right? My team had to be 50% new blood, new technologists, data scientists, AI experts, folks who were thinking about the ethical nature of what we were doing with analytics, and also people who truly understood how these large enterprises worked, right? And PepsiCo has no shortage of amazing talent. There were amazing people to go out and pick from, and some jobs required that. I'll give you an example: data governance, which is this, bandied about word. It's a hard word, right? Because it sounds very
Yeah.
bureaucratic. It sounds
Yeah.
like you're slowing down enterprise progress, but it's really understanding how to organize the information you have. And
Yeah.
those folks we had to find from within the company, and that was during COVID. That was difficult, right? Because
How
these companies are built on relationships, and when you can't
yeah.
go out and meet them, it was tough.
So what did you offer them? How did you make it attractive? Yeah.
I think this is where culture plays a really important role. We wanted to build a team that felt like they had a purpose, and to be clear, we also had an incredible amount of support. One of the very few advantages that COVID gave us was some of our executives had more time. In fact, our CEO, Ramon LaGuarta, who is a wonderful CEO, had more time. And so I was able to spend some time directly with him on, at one point, a weekly basis to try and understand what the ideas he had for the future of the company. And it is astonishing when you have a CEO who is willing to learn, willing to listen, and then makes the decisions that he or she needs to make sure that the company is thinking about the future. And Ramon is very much one of those CEOs. And he gave us direction and purpose and guidance, and really allowed us to build a team that would use the best of what was in the company, but allow us to bring in what we needed to bring in to transform not just all the shiny metal objects of AI and analytics and all the cool applications we could build, but actually fixing the infrastructure, right? Fundamentally understanding that any large enterprise organization today has too much data, right? They have more data than they need typically. And
Yeah.
the problem is how to get that organized, especially when you've been used to operating in a variety of different ways. And that problem, by the way, I saw at ESPN, we saw at
Everyone.
Nielsen, and
Yes,
it's in any
silos.
company you see today. Everybody is on a journey, right? And what makes it tricky is technology is shifting so quickly now. The question is, when you're making these big investments and tens of millions,
They're
hundreds
already
of millions,
outdated.
how
The moment
quickly
you
does it get
yeah.
outdated? Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's part of the magic, is trying to understand where are we today, where do we need to go, and then it's not a straight line. It's kind of it's like navigating by boat. You have to pick a path. We are going to go here, and maybe the seas will be rough today, and maybe the winds will take us that way. But you finally make it there, and then you make it to the next one, and you make it to the next one. But culture, I think, is what keeps the boat sort of afloat, right? And so I focused very hard on creating a sense of belonging for this company and for these people, because they needed to believe that they could actually impact transformation at a company like PepsiCo or a company like Nielsen or a company like ESPN. And without that sort of guiding North Star, I think it's very difficult to succeed. And we had a lot of support in doing that.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, is the most important factor, right? Like having people supporting each other, communicating and brainstorming. Because what other factors do you think are setting apart those companies which are winning the race and being competitive and
Look,
being...
I think the human differentiator is the greatest, right? And after Hugh, I had a manager named Athena Kanura. And Athena is Dr. Athena Kanura. She's a remarkable woman. She actually ran a huge portion of the Accenture analytics world. And when she came in, she had a PhD in sort of the early days of statistics and data science. So she ran all of strategy and transformation at the time that I was there. And to have somebody who fundamentally understands the language in which you speak, has strong ideas, and can really speak to everyone on your team, from a data scientist up to a chief strategist, it makes it much easier, right? And you have then creating joint goals for the leadership team of the company becomes easier, because you have somebody who supports you, who is thinking about what you're thinking about, obviously has a broader remit and other things that she was thinking about for the broader digital and corporate transformation of the company. But you don't have to explain everything to her, because she knows. right? And so to have that support, to have Ramon, to have Hugh when the initial phase of my job, that was an amazing thing, right? And then as we built out the company, as we built out the function, I'm sorry, we found people that really had the same passion and energy for what it is we did. And the cool thing was there were plenty of them to be found. And during COVID, it was an interesting reaction that everybody had, right? There was some guilt about not being in the office. And so we worked extremely hard. I mean, I remember long phases, I mean quarters of, 15, 18-hour days where, and you remember, everybody remembers it, right? We were on Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting or Teams or
but that wasn't necessarily healthy.
Oh no, it wasn't.
Some
it wasn't.
some
And as you
companies were
mentioned, that
overdoing
pendulum has swung a little bit, right? So we had a lot of people who got used to working from home or moved to other places.
Yeah.
My best friend got up from New York City and moved to the mountains in Montana, and loves it there and has never come back. And I think, as you pointed out, some of that pendulum has swung back. Companies are requiring people to be back in the office. Before I left PepsiCo, I said we need you to be in the office for 3 days, but there was some flexibility around how you do that. I spoke to a lot of my peers around what they were doing, and similar things. 2-3 days in the office, and then some flexibility around that for large corporations. Other companies have gone completely remote. Especially a lot of smaller companies, and I now have a business where I advise young startups in the AI space. And a lot of them went remote forever, right? Because they realized that if they wanted to, as I talked about earlier, if the defining factor is your human talent to allow technology to really thrive, you have to go where the fish are. And that means as the world has changed, you find people
everywhere.
where you can, right? And
True.
I think with a lot of them, they had a tremendous amount of success. I do think it can be harder with large corporations because in order to create a sense of solidarity, you do need to spend time with the business.
Yeah.
And one of the things that became very clear to us was in order for our analytics products to succeed, we needed the business to fundamentally understand what we did. And so we spent a lot of time on education and a lot of time on visiting, right? As soon as it became possible to do that, we did a huge program, which we've talked about before this. So I can spend some time talking about it, where we had the first education program was for the top 250 people at the company. Right? Because in a conversation with Ramon and me, he said, listen, we've got to educate the people making the investment decisions, not just the folks who are using the tools. And again, that kind of foresight from a CEO is so helpful, right? Because it allows you to then focus your activities on the things that matter. And I will tell you that education program served us for the next 4 years.
So how did it work? So what was the main objective, and how, what struggle and what was the stimuli? What was the reason why you decided to implement?
I think in order to, at a company like PepsiCo or in a company like Disney, in order to actually take out powerful new technology products that will change jobs, change organizational structures, change the way people are used to operating, sometimes very successfully, right? These are not companies that were not having a problem. These were companies that have done very well. And sometimes it's harder to change a company that's done very well than to change a company that hasn't, because the impetus for change, as you've pointed out, might be less. That's where you need leadership, right? Where you need people like a Bob Iger at Disney or a Ramon at PepsiCo to say, we are setting a North Star because we are anticipating change down the road. And we want to make sure, no matter what's going on now, we want to create an environment where we are encouraging change, not just for the sake of change, but because we know the company will require it, right? And that's why education is not just the first step. Education is an evergreen process. And, I do wish every company would do education more often, because we get very used to the idea that we have these very smart, capable people. And we brought them in, or we've educated them based on what we knew they knew. But sometimes they're afraid to say, I don't know, right? And in some cases I don't blame them. It's hard, right? You have to get up and say, look, there's this completely new way of doing something that I've been doing for 10, 20, in some cases at PepsiCo and Disney, 40 years, right? And it's different. And everything I thought I knew about how to do my job and how many people it would require and how much investment I have to put in is changing. And everyone loves change if it doesn't affect them, right? Right. I mean, and that's the nature of that process. So it can be difficult, and it can be hard, and it can be it can be humbling, right? And I think if you go in there with the attitude that this is about learning, this is about experience, and we have to be part of how these things change, and that means your path might eventually lead somewhere else, and that's what happened with me and others. Um, we are part of a story. We're part of a chapter in a book, right? And that book, you have one that is your own life, your own book, your own story, your own experience, and the other is the life of these companies. And sometimes you'll be part of them, sometimes you won't. But I think if you can find, again, going back to the things that matter, find culture, find innovation, find curiosity, and use those as your North Stars for change. And be confident in the fact that learning is the most powerful tool you can possess. I think those are all powerful qualities, and at well-run companies like the ones I worked for, I think we've seen success with it.
This is what will save people
Yeah.
in this whole transformational, exponential time of where using tools embedded with AI. It's becoming like the normal type of work you are doing. It's a commodity. So you have to put focus into like self-learning and being more creative than what another person can do with.
Yeah, no, look, it's
things.
absolutely true. It was interesting. I was at when I think about that notion of how you reskill yourself and relearn, people always ask me, how do I get, especially business leaders are like, how do I get smarter about what's possible?
Yeah.
What I always tell them is with AI, especially now, technology is changing so fast. If you spend just the extra time necessary to understand for your particular space, whether it's vertical or horizontal, what is most interesting in AI? There are so many opportunities to do it. There's stuff online, there's people, there's social media with people who genuinely know what they're talking about. There's educational stuff on YouTube. There are professional programs, there are graduate degrees. There's a million ways you can become an expert. And you can be the greatest expert in the world if you focus on it for the next 6 months, right? Because there's just so much specialization happening that nobody can be everything, right? But it takes effort. And it takes lean in, and it takes, again, that humility of saying, I don't know what the future holds for what it is that I do. I can learn about it. I can become an expert on it. I have the aptitude and the skill. But if I sit back and just hope that the storm blows me by, then I think that you are putting a lot of things at risk, right? And especially if you are a manager, if you're a significant manager, and some of these people, these large corporations run thousands, 10,000s of people. You're doing a disservice to all of the people who work for you as well, because change will impact them, right? Whether they like it or not. And it might come slowly. It might come in a measured way where you are actually sort of controlling that change, or it will come with a way that you don't like and you don't expect, right? And so pick a poison a little bit, right? Take the extra time, make the effort, lean in, educate, upskill, talk to people, network, connect with some of the thinking around there. I mean, there are so many great opportunities, like listening to something like this, going to conferences. I'm part of a couple of different organizations like World 50, where you can connect with some of your peers, which for me has been incredibly educational. And I owe a lot to some of the conversations I've had with my peers who are, again, chief data analytics officers are kind of a right brain, left brain combination of smart, interesting people who understand the business, who also understand technology. And they're usually very generous, right? And I've always said to young people, reach out to the people in your organization, no matter how senior they are, and ask for time. The worst they can say is no, right? And at that point, even the acknowledgement that you tried is something. And I think that spirit of curiosity and exploration and innovation will now become a keystone to how we operate in the world today, because it won't just be about what you know or what knowledge is resident in your head. All knowledge is now available. The question is, how do you utilize that? How do you make it real? And for that, you have to go out into the world.
Yeah. Which brings me to another aspect of, you have a lot of knowledge, but some of it is not real. Some of it is fake. Some of the things you're reading, people just spread are not good for you. So how, in your opinion, how can you verify what's the right?
How you build your mental filters on this stuff is everything, right? As you pointed out, there is infinite knowledge available now. We have more power in our phones than they did going to the moon 50 years ago, 60 years ago. More than that now. And so beginning to understand how you differentiate between what is real and what is not will be a key skill, right? And I think the best way to do that is through the people filter, not through the technology filter, right? Very often you have to pick your sources of information. And I'm going to stay away from anything political, but we live in a world today that's highly polarized, right? And media, content, messaging, even what my face looks like can be replicated, can be changed, can be altered, can be transformed, can be used for purposes that are nefarious or even sort of malicious, right? And so figuring out how you trust, and I use that word casually, but that word trust is unbelievably important, right? I think about it a lot. And one of the things I talked to my teams about at PepsiCo specifically was trust is our most important word. The fact that the company needs to trust us, that we are coming in with the right intent and the right tools and the right technology and the right opportunities. The fact that they have trust in the data itself, that the data is correct, that it is, data can be very dirty in all its forms. It depends who put it in, it depends how it was created, it depends how it was structured or unstructured, how it was analyzed, what models were used to decrypt its secrets. And then finally, what were the outputs of these products and applications that we've created, right? Are they better than what they've been using before? Are they not? And so both that personal trust in the fact that we are doing the right thing and that professional trust in the fact that the data and applications are right is very important. And the last piece is what you just described, which is we also operate in a world where we need external data signals, right? Whatever they might be. And some of those now are beginning to be less trusted than they were back when there were very few signals.
Distorted,
And they were regulated or managed. I mean, now the world is global. We are linked to everyone in one way or the other. There are very many ways for people to sort of not do the right thing. And again, that's why we need governance. We need the world to think about this stuff. I know we were talking earlier about the fact that I've spent time with sort of the World Economic Forum and some of the work they've been doing with a lot of my peers, with regulatory bodies, with governmental and legislative bodies. And the amount of information is widely variant in terms of what people know, right? I mean, we have legislation sometimes being created by very smart young aides who are, spending 3-6 months, even a year, trying to understand all of AI. It's a difficult job, right? And then you're trying to create legislation for the future when the technology is changing every 6 months, every 3 months, every month. I was as I mentioned, I was at a World Economic Forum conference late last year where it was their first forum on data governance and really thinking about sort of, what's going to change. And they had legislators and technologists and operational leaders like myself. And sort of one of the things that came up a ton was the speed at which this particular revolution is taking place, right? When you think about even the internet revolution or the mobile revolution, the technology revolution, even the industrial revolution, you had some time to figure some stuff out. With AI, what we do today in 6 months could be completely redundant. And I don't mean a little bit redundant. I don't mean you can keep using that old one for 3 years and it'll kind of be all right. It's not going to work, right? Not the same way. So I think that pace of change is new. And the amount of impact it's having, mainly because now consumers have become very aware of it since the end of 2022 when ChatGPT became real. And suddenly they saw in all of the consumer applications that they were used to dealing with that there was this revolutionary new way to think about how content is generated and how sort of you can speak to a computer, if you will, and how it can create things for you that were just not possible before this. Suddenly AI, which had been around for decades, became all in the forefront. And we see, again, the same hype cycle. Some of the stuff that people were expecting to work is not working. I always laugh about this. When I presented, I used the analogy of an iceberg, right? It actually became the logo of our team subsequent to that because the top of the iceberg is, the 10% that you see, and it's the AI and the analytics and the cool stuff. But the bottom of the iceberg is the data, right? And data goes from sexy to non-sexy to sexy to non-sexy, and it's kind of in between right now. And it's painful, right? Nobody wants to hear about how complicated it is to get your data organized. But I think what's changing is historically when analytics were presented, primarily a report, usually numbers. And often there was a fair amount of healthy skepticism. These are not my reports, these are not my numbers, where do you get them from? With some of the stuff that's being generated now, it could read like a report written by a human analyst who took a week to report it, except it took 1 second to generate by an AI. And you are more likely to believe something when you believe that it came from what felt like a human, right? And that could
Yeah.
be a written report. And there's lots of talk now about a lot of startups now are working with the creation of human face and voice and emotion. There are earnings calls happening with some of these things happening on them now.
Yeah.
Not just the analysis of those from real people, but the creation of fake people essentially talking about things in an expressive way that you and I would consider the domain of a human before that. You're more likely to believe that. That's just how we're biologically hardwired.
Do you? Because there is this concept of uncanny valley, right? We humans can feel that something is off, and
Yeah.
it makes us uncomfortable.
Yes. Look, with graphics, we crossed that barrier a long time ago, right? I mean, if you remember the early days of 3D effects in movies, you would have that sort of weirdness, and as you
Yeah.
mentioned, that uncanny valley notion that you can tell that they're not quite there. Deepfakes now are unbelievably good, right? I mean, quite frankly, in most cases, you will not be able to tell the difference. Often, some of these AIs are beating Turing tests, which is the proof that you are in fact human, right? And maybe these tests need to be changed and reevaluated. And I think the line between what is created and what is real, as you've pointed out, is a lot more gray. And quite frankly, most of us are not equipped anymore to tell the difference of truly advanced technology. And was it Arthur C. Clarke who said, the difference between magic and sort of magic is just science that we haven't understood yet,
Yeah.
right?
I heard
And
that.
so a lot of the things that we're seeing now feel magical because for a lot of us, we're not fully conversant with how and why they were created. And you think about, some of the darker side of this stuff, fraud, and earlier it used to be phishing emails or a text sent you a thing from somebody you thought. Now it could be a voicemail from your or a video
Yes.
voicemail from your mother saying I'm in trouble and I need money and so and so. And lots of people have fallen prey to scamming already. Lots of companies have been hacked, ransomware, all sorts of things are happening in cyber. And there's no shortage of scary things that can be done with these technologies. But again, when Jenny and I first came out, every board, every CEO, every senior leader wanted to know how they could be more relevant in this. And one of the first things we did was to say, hold on, right? Large language models are processing data in some cases from as much of the internet as they can see. Some of this data is not copyrighted. Some of this data we cannot use. If you actually ask a question of a large language model, you are educating it. Are you educating them on things that you should not be educating them on? And obviously, we worked with our large technology partners to figure out how to privatize those notions. And every CDAO will tell you they're figuring out how to essentially create a shared but private space, right, where they can converse with the AIs without losing all of their corporate information. But that warning was important. We're at the stage with AI a little like Prometheus with fire. Right, we know that it's this unbelievably in fact, I used a stronger analogy when I was talking to some of my leaders at PepsiCo. I said this is like nuclear technology, right? It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. The technology itself doesn't care. It's our application of them as human beings that is going to matter. And so we have to be cautious as we think through this because, again, like I said, AI is not new, but some of these things can change how people live and sort of work in the world today, and we have to be cautious about that, especially for a large corporation.
There's efficient efforts to think about potential risks, such as the AGI concept and how it can transform like the way we collaborate, the way we live, and whom we fall in love whom we decide to love, like that kind of strange concepts which we previously seen in sci-fi movies.
Yeah, and look, I've been a huge sci-fi buff since I was a kid. I firmly believe that most of our ideas are not new; they've been written about by somebody, right? It's a question of, again, how we manifest the magic into reality through science. And as you've pointed out, the technology is progressing so fast that sometimes the mechanisms that manage them are struggling to keep up, right? Whether that's legislation or regulation or even industry conversation. There are fundamentally different ways that governments are approaching it. When you think about how Singapore or China is approaching it versus the US, there are fundamental differences with sort of how that's being done, how that's being regulated. And we don't know right now which one is going to win or which one is the best. We just know that there are different approaches to this thing. And because we live in a global village, it means that companies like the ones I've worked at and that a lot of your viewers are working at, we are operating in a variety of different spaces, right? Whether that's geographical spaces or technology spaces, or even how much technical debt they have. So can they go and quickly build something fast right now without having to worry about fixing all their, in some cases, billions of dollars of systems that they've already built? Or do they have to really think about what that technical debt is? And so each engagement, as I spend more time in consulting, is particularly different, right? There is no silver bullet for everyone. There is no common answer for have we sorted out bias? Have we thought about a regulatory framework? Have we thought about an ethical framework for how we think about the utility of this analytics? And simple examples like when we think about marketing, if the AI can go off and learn in a way that is fundamentally unhuman because it's not human, right? And even the word ethics is so interesting, right? Whose ethics? Mine? Yours? Ours? In this company? In this country? In this part of the world? Ethics are a fungible thing, and we are quick to forgive humans for having different ethical values. We will not forgive technology for having different ethical values. And so that's a philosophical question, right? We're now because we're getting so close to the domain of what was previously only humans' business to determine. We are now beginning to give some of those things to the technology, right? Whether that's predicting financial analysis all the way to deciding who do we market to, right?
Yeah.
This notion of human in the loop is not going to become less important. It's going to become more important.
It definitely will, because maybe it does not have ethics, but the repercussions, the consequences of the algorithm doing, I don't know, giving that kind of score instead of other may have fundamental consequences for a person.
Of course. And, the standard use case is you're teaching an autonomous car what to do in every scenario. And it's about to have an accident. And it's there's one group of people, and there's a young child, and there's one group of people
And the older.
And how does it pick, right? And this goes to the heart of what is a human determination.
Yeah.
Is at some point you have to tell the systems and the models to do something that only a human historically has decided. And I think that will be very hard for us all to deal with, right? Especially when you think about the history of analytics, it was primarily sort of descriptive and diagnostic, right? Essentially, it was looking in the rearview mirror, showing us what has happened so we as humans can make a determination as to what to do in the future. Now it's becoming predictive, right? So it's beginning to tell us, hey, here's what I think will happen in the future. Or it's even prescriptive, which is, here is what you should do. I, as a systems technology, I'm going to tell you as a human being what to do. And that is a very, very different relationship, right? So this notion of what is technology and what is human determinant and what is technology determinant is becoming, all intermeshed. And I think it's going to make it has made a lot of people very uncomfortable, right? And, there are questions ranging from, will my job be gone? Will my industry be gone? Am I teaching how my children what their world is going to be like, because it's going to be so fundamentally different from ours in terms of how they learn, what they learn, why they learn.
You are teaching them, or they are teaching you.
And ideally, it should be both, right? Because I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, and I'm learning from them constantly, right? Because they fundamentally operate differently. Because they are so used to having this infinite amount of knowledge. I remember when I was growing up, maybe this dates me, but we had to go to an encyclopedia or a library to gain knowledge, right? It was the early days of the internet, and it was so exciting when you could actually access something through the web. This next generation, even the one that's sort of in the younger stages of their career, they are used to having limitless access, right? And so they're instant, limitless. So it's the analytics that is becoming everything, right? Because gathering the data itself, when you think about jobs from 25 years ago when you were coming out of college, you would do analyst jobs, right? Especially if you're a smart white collar worker who's interested in doing things in technology or finance or CPG, you would go and be an analyst. And the cool thing about being an analyst was not only did you learn how to put together this information, but you learned about the companies and the industries while you were doing it. Now, we don't need people necessarily to do a lot of that, right? I mean, that data can be gathered and analyzed by a well-constructed system. But how it is utilized at a company, how those decisions are made, have to be human determinant. And again, if a human is not in the loop during the creation of that data, during the management of that data, during the creation of the analytics and applications and tools that are deciding then the outputs, something very strange is going to start to happen, right? Which is the system is going to make determinants of its own. And we don't want that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yet so many people start relying on those systems for advice, sometimes, quite, which can have dire consequences.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, that's not new, right? I mean, when you're in a plane today and a pilot is relying on systems that are highly electronic to keep you alive and safe and on your way to, what would be miraculous 50 years ago, we have gotten pretty used to doing that, right? We do that in every day. How often do we touch our phones, right? Every few seconds. We're constantly relying on technology-derived information to determine where we're going, how we're going, what to tell the car, what music to play, what to tell our children, how to order food. Like, we're doing it constantly, and it's only going to get more and more intense, right? And granted, that's not for everyone. I grew up in India, and we still have a lot of people sitting under the poverty line, but most of them have a cell phone because that is access to knowledge. Right, fundamental access to knowledge. So it spans the gamut of human population at this point in terms of how they access information is beginning to become uniform in the sense that it's not limited to the rich or the powerful or people in a particular country. A lot of people have access to a lot of information, as you pointed out, nearly limitless, right? The question now becomes is how do we still give them things to do that matter, right? And what are those things that are truly human only versus what are the things, and even when I say human only, it's always enabled by technology, right? But what are the decisions that specifically should not be made by machines? And that, again, begins to become, there are some that are very clear, very black and white, very easy to understand. Some that are much more amorphous, much more gray, much more philosophical. And that's where, as you pointed out, governments are talking, NGOs are talking, private corporations are talking, public corporations are talking, watchdog organizations are keeping an eye out to make sure they're thinking about how legislation is created, how we're enforcing it. But it's a whole new world of governance. And again, I think we have to be very careful to use that word in a positive sense, right? Because it requires good people to work hard on things that matter. For us to be a better society. But I fundamentally believe technology can do that if we all sort of do the right thing.
Yeah, it's just a tool we've created and it's supposed to serve us. But what worries me is that, in a way, those technologists, those creators, are trying to design systems which will do the thinking for us to too wide extent, meaning we will become lazy. We can become less creative because all the choice will be limited and just giving to us to consume.
There are these two great movies that illustrate this point. There was one made 15 years ago now called Idiocracy, where someone comes from the past into the future and everyone's kind of an idiot because they're now reliant on the world and technology giving them what they need. The other movie, which I think is fascinating for this, is WALL-E, the story about the robot, right? Where all the humans are sitting on like floating couches and just watching sort of media and have no real curiosity anymore. And look, there's lots of dystopian futures possible, right? Where technology takes over and does all sorts of strange things. I mean, look, in the 50s and 60s, we were worried that nuclear technology would destroy the world, right? So I think all revolutions are difficult, right? We have to go through a significant period of change and understand what this change means. And that's why I don't think it's enough for us to sit back and say, it'll figure itself out, right? This is where people who have curiosity and innovation and care about the world have to be sort of aggressive about saying, we are interested in determining what our future will look like. And I will tell you, again, my parents' generation, our generation, we've had it pretty good, right? Since the Second World War through till now, while the world has gone through a lot of pain, less global pain than the generations that preceded it. And now we have scenarios where, climate's a very real concern and should be sort of a highly real concern for us. I do some work in that space too, which I think is very, very important. And then there's this technology revolution that is changing everything about how the haves and the have-nots live, right? And again, there's lots of social. You could spend an hour just talking about the social sort of consequences of what this does in terms of the creation of wealth in certain demographics versus not in others, sort of the geopolitical implications of what it is that we're going through. But I think in the end, we have to think about what we can do personally, right? And how we can create culture in our professional lives, in our personal lives, how we can educate those that need education, how we can uplift people. And I fundamentally believe we can uplift everyone, right? I mean, we have to believe that. And it's not what everyone thinks. And some people are very direct about that, that they're more mercenary about saying, these people can be educated, these people cannot. I don't believe that. I think everyone can be educated in certain ways. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think teams have to be changed or reorganized. I think they do. But I think we can do it in a way that is fundamentally human, especially when we are dealing with situations that are very, very technology driven, to your point. We have to create a safe space for that sort of the human permeating the technology to allow the technology to be utilized to its full potential in a way that is safe for us as a people.
And we can do it finally at scale because it can be personalized.
Of course.
This whole
I mean, the notion of this many to many interface in the world today it exists, right? I mean, the internet exists, and it's not just when I say the internet, I'm using a broad term for it. It's all the ways that we sort of relate to technology, right? And I remember, reading early books or watching early movies about the notion of the AI in your ear, right? That one day that's all you will need. You'll be talking to something, and the system, the many words for it, avatar, etc., is going to tell you what you need to know, right? You don't have to access anything. You don't have to type anything. You will just have to ask or think. Here's what I need to know, and it's available to me. So then, what are we doing? Sort of, what are we responsible for? What are we? And again, philosophical and social questions aside about who controls the machines, right? I mean, those are very real questions. Is it going to be the technologists who become sort of, not to use a poorly used word in Indian history, but sort of a caste of technologists who will control the future? To some degree, that's happened, right? I mean, when you think about companies that are changing the world today, primarily there are technology companies that are creating the most impact, right?
Yes.
And are impacting every industry. And I remember when I first came into my first set of CDO roles, it used to be digital media and advertising and marketing and technology and even CPG and retail to some degree that were kind of doing this. Now it's everyone, right? It doesn't matter whether you're manufacturing something or mining iron ore. You are using technology in a fundamentally different way than you used 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It is becoming. I hesitate to say that every company is a technology company. Every company is not a technology company, but every company utilizes technology and digital technology, or they should be. Otherwise, they're going to fall behind their competitors in the space. So. And governments are doing the same thing. Educational institutions are doing the same thing, and they have to, right? I think a lot about, obviously, as any parent does, about how do you educate your children and what do you tell them to do. And for me, it's I have strongly focused with my children on how to understand how people operate, right? Like, what does that look like? Your friends, your organizations, the things you compete in, your athletics. It's about people. So think about that. And the second part is not just how do you access knowledge anymore, but how are you analyzing information, right, for some utility? Because the power right now, I remember I grew up in India where we had to learn 100,000 formula for physics and 100,000 formula for math. You're not allowed to use a calculator. And I'll tell you, it gave you a great basis for being a good scientist or a good engineer. But in a lot of ways, it didn't teach you how to survive in an environment where the human connectivity is going to become increasingly important. And as you grow in your career, you will find that you'll be spending more time with people than less. Right? Maybe fewer people and maybe people who make more decisions. But in the end, that human interaction becomes as much part of your job as it was earlier in the day, just a different kind.
I read the other day, I don't know if it is already a legislation or it's just a project that there is a there is an idea to limit consumption of social media and protect youth. Because even I remember my childhood without a phone, without being constantly, it is an addiction. And what you see now, I don't know how you do it with your children, but it feels like they are being sucked into it, and they are too young to understand how to fight with it, how to use it responsibly.
Yeah, look, I think this is an impossible problem to solve, right? It is a moment of dramatic change. It is a moment when you're absolutely right. I think social media has overwhelmed a lot of children, and I've certainly seen it in my own children. And we've tried as parents to make the best trade-offs possible, but we made mistakes along the way. I mean, I think we all do, and we've had to optimize. And I think that notion of experimenting and optimization is going to be the way. Right. And there will be experiments in states, in countries, in continents around how to manage this. Right. I mean, China does it very different from Europe. Europe does it very different from the US. Even in the US, there are states that do it very fundamentally different from each other because of, political views or personal views or the views of the legislators of that state. And we're going to figure it out one way or the other. And there will be some mistakes along the way. There'll probably be a lot of mistakes along the way, but that's true with any new technology, right? But as you pointed out, this is a technology that's fundamentally reshaping sort of the human world in a very, very real way. And as with anything like that, I think we have to be cautious and we have to be careful and we have to do the work we have to do. The problem is, in this particular scenario, if we wait too long to do that, it's already evolved to the next stage. And our children have a lot of access. In the U.S., there's a ton of privilege, and you're beginning to see the differential between folks who have access to more knowledge earlier on and folks who do not. And I, as a technologist myself, I had to really struggle early on with not allowing my children to have access to this technology. Yeah. And I made some mistakes along the way. Gave them access too early, pulled it back, right? And then we had COVID. And for 2 years, all the rules we built around not giving our children access to this stuff was eliminated because it was the only way they could communicate with their friends and their family. And we had no choice, right? And children came out of that changed. I saw it. We all saw it. Yeah. And one of the nice things was they came out sort of hungry for human connection and contact, and that was great. But also more dependent on digital and technology than they probably would have been if we didn't go through that terrible event, right? So I think that accelerated many things, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, and it changed the way people behave. Some of those behaviors are going back, some of them will not. But, this is like Pandora's box. There's no putting this back in. It's a question of how do we manage it now that it's out in a way that is best for society again. I'll go back to that best for society thing because I think technologists absolutely have a responsibility to be thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and right now with the whole personalization and the real-time, context and information gathering and insights, it's even like in terms of if we are thinking about the aspect of education, it's going to be more present in not only children, but particularly children environment. So I guess, yes, like we need human relationships and being within others, but it will just be much easier to learn and discover new things, I guess, through asking what I'm trying to get into is assistants, AI assistants, right?
Yeah.
Like the whole new.
If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be a lot richer than I am today, right? It's one of those things where I don't know that it's been figured out yet. There's a lot of, but like the Facebooks and the Googles and the Metas and the Instagrams and the WhatsApp, there will be new variants of these new tools, right? And maybe one of them one day will be sort of the information god in your head that tells you everything you need to know. I mean, look, people have been trying to do this for decades, sort of be that one source of information. And it's a very powerful thing, right? And how governments will actually react to that is going to be interesting to watch. And there will be more tension, I fundamentally believe, between private corporations and governments because the incentives are fundamentally different in some cases, right? I mean, you're beholden to your shareholders versus you're beholden to your citizenry. And then, are you a citizen of the world? How do you think about that? But in the end, I'm going to care most about my family and the people I love and the ones who depend on me. So how do you manage all those boundaries? And look, that's the human condition, right? We've been doing this ever since we were sort of, using rocks to kill animals tens of thousands of years ago. So how we continue to evolve as a society, I think, will be, as you pointed out, heavily influenced by how technology enables us to be. But in the end, if a child behaves badly, it's partially the child, but it's also the parents and the community and the village in which they were raised. And so again, it's about creating, as we've talked about earlier, the right sort of universally agreed upon ethical principles as to how we use these technologies. Now, there will always be bad actors. There will always be people who try to, gain profit or do things in a malicious way because it gives them an advantage in some ways. But I fundamentally am an optimist. I believe in the power of the human condition, and I believe that there are more people focused on doing good for society than not. And so it's even more dependent on us now, especially if we live in one of these worlds, to be thinking about frameworks and ways and education policies to allow this stuff to happen the right way. And it matters who you vote for. It matters how you give feedback back to the people that you work for. It matters how you treat the people who work for you. And again, that's just things that you teach your children every day, and you should, right? About how to behave in society. It's the same thing. I don't think the fundamental rules change. I think the tools we have and the access we have changes. But again, it comes back to, what do you believe your values and principles are, right? Yeah. And are we more ready to agree on those things than disagree? And then we can find ways to apply them to technology.
Mm-hmm. And you said that you are optimist. Like, I also do feel it's like mainly good, what's happening and the things we are creating. But what are the particular aspects of technology or areas which you probably advise or work on, which you would love to for other people to put more attention to,
Look, I think luckily for me, luckily or unluckily, the things that I operate in are getting a lot of attention. In fact, they're getting too much attention. Some might argue, right? I mean, if you're in the AI world, if you're in the analytics world, if you're in the technology world, it's all anyone's talking about today, right? Because either in fear, because they're worried, they do something very manual and they're worried that thing might go away, something that they learned for the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years is not applicable anymore. And so they're trying to understand what that looks like, or they are part of this milieu who is setting principles and standards and stages for companies or governments or people or organizations. And, we're getting to make a lot of decisions with long-lasting consequences. But again, I think it's very hard for one person to do it anymore, right? It has to be part of an ecosystem as to how that is managed. And sort of making sure that we can continue to build that in the right way is important. I think technologies like sort of the interface between human and analytics is going to become very important, right? So not just the technology that builds the analytics tools, but the translation layer between that and us, right? And whether that's, again, the bug in your ear or reports or visuals or sort of new applications that we're now using to communicate with the world and how do we express ourselves, that layer is going to become very, very important because, to your point, that layer is going to become reality to some degree, right? One of my favorite books ever is a book called Snow Crash, written by a guy named Neil Stephenson. And it was written a long time ago. It was very early. It talked about the early days of cyber. And it originated the term meta and cyber. And it talked a lot about sort of the duality of the world that will exist when a digital twin of the world is in place, right? Yeah. And what is language and what is communication? And suddenly it becomes all these highfalutin ideas. It's almost too much to contain in one brain. But I think you got to pick a piece that you can have impact on, right? And then and usually you have impact on many pieces. Your family, the people who work with you, the people who work for you, the people who you work for, the other organizations you spend your time in, the hobbies that you spend your time in. I'm a passionate car guy and racing guy, and we have a really rich community here in the Northeast US. And sort of how you go out there and present yourself and talk about the things that matter to you and the evolution of that world is important. And so finding time, finding balance for all those things, I think is going to become very, very important. And, some people have different ideas of what balance looks like. I like true balance, balance between family and time for yourself and then deep professional satisfaction from the things that you do. And I hope most people have that opportunity. I think I've been very lucky.
Was it actually, that was my next question. So perfectly you swooped into it. So was it something you seen among your family, or something which you had to mature and understand that, family and time off work matters, and
Yeah, I
work
mean,
is not
look,
everything.
I think it's always both. I mean, I have an amazing family, very educated, they believe that education is the most important thing that you can do and that you can support the family. I'm very close to them. My mother's an architect, my father's a cardiothoracic surgeon, my grandfather was a general in the Indian Army and also a doctor. My other grandfather was an industrialist who worked for a group called the Tatas for many, many years and taught me everything I ever wanted to know about integrity. So I had an amazing amount of support growing up. I went to a great school. I went to a great college. I was very blessed in that. Not everybody has those opportunities, right? And I recognize that that creates differentials. And I think my children have a lot of those privileges and opportunities too, right? They go to great schools. They get a lot of support. They have a strong family to support them. That doesn't always happen. And look, it doesn't mean that these children are going to be the most successful, right? Sometimes hunger is what gives you success, right? I mean, or not having is what gives you success. But and so I don't know that there's a formula for happiness, right? But I think a lot of it is, to your point, how you were raised and who raises you. And then the other part is sort of, what does that first part do to you and allow you to think about what you need, right? And so if you don't have that, do you go out there and find it? And some of that is implicit in who you are and personality. And I remember I have two boys and they're very different kids. And I was like, how can both these children have come from the same two parents? But they did, right? I mean, and that's the magic of the human brain is it's this unbelievably complex computer.
But also society around, like the friends they choose.
Yeah, the friend. I mean, and there's so many small factors, so many variables, right? What sport did you play? What were you a theater? I mean, I was a theater kid who also played sports, so I got, I always loved having multiple communities, and again, probably speaks to my ADD that I needed the theater people and the basketball people and the rugby people and and the technology people, and for me, like, a little bit of all of it was the most interesting part, rather than becoming very verticalized. I have friends, all they care about is one thing, right? And again, like I said, success is not dependent on having one or the other way of operating, right? Often
there's so many different formulas. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I think those variables are hard, right? I mean, there is, if everyone knew the formula for success, we'd all be using it. So, and the other thing I think, again, success for me is sometimes kind of a tough word too, right? I believe I am constantly successful because I love my life, right? I enjoy the life that I have. And it doesn't mean bad things don't happen. Of course they do. People get sick, people die, people, jobs come, jobs go, bad things happen to people that you care about. But I think it's how you respond to them that is important, right? And I'm certainly not stating that that's the only way to be. Like that for me, that everyone talks about grit and resilience and all these things. But if there's anything I wanted my children to learn, it's not just how to live in a golden cocoon, right? It is to know that there are difficult things in the world, and some of them they will inevitably have to face, and give them the strength to understand that they can, right? That they will. And look, sometimes those things are chemically taken away from people. Your brain chemistry might not allow for that. And so we have to be empathetic to the world around us, try and understand that there is no easy buckets of neurobehavior. There is a wide spectrum of how people behave. And I typically tend to find when you are not given one thing, you're typically given another. You just have to figure out what that thing is, right? So for me, ADD comes with certain things, and corporate ADD, which is a manifestation, it also comes with certain things. And you have to find your own path through that, right? And figure out sort of how you perceive the world, how the world perceives you, and how you can operate through it in a way using technology, using your relationships, using your experience, and asking for guidance, asking for wisdom, asking for experience. I love talking to what used to be my grandparents' generation, because I do believe there is fundamental knowledge in experience and age. And I think sometimes some families don't allow for that. And I one of the things that I love is when my children get to hang out with their grandparents,
Yes.
right, or their grandparents' friends, and just hear about stories of doing things and being through stuff, and good things and bad things and hard things and easy things. And I think technology will hopefully enable some of these stories to be told better too. We'll see.
I think that's uniquely human, right? Learning and growing through stories.
And if we
That's
can
something
teach
which-
our AI how to learn and grow the same way, my hope is that more will be beneficial than not, right? And if we can allow that to happen with people, we can allow that to happen with the technologies we create.
I think this is a perfect ending to our chat.
I think so too.
You've summed it up really, really nicely. Okay. So just the last question.
Yeah.
So reflecting on your career, which accomplishments are you most proud of?
It's always the teams I've built. Always the teams I've built. A lot of people who've worked for me have now worked for me at multiple companies, in one case, 4 or 5 companies. And the cultures I built, the things that we did together were important. The value that we drove for shareholders was important. But I think it was the communities that we created. And it was not limited to one company. It was not limited to one industry. It was not limited to one geography. I think we created a wonderful ecosystem, and we continue to rely on each other and uplift each other and talk to each other and learn from each other. And that is what I am by far the proudest of.
Sounds like you are a great boss. I will do some research to see if it's the same on the other side. No, I'm sure. Okay, great. Thank you, Vikram. It's been a
really good
huge pleasure.